I don't have that many updates on the research side of things, I would say. Um, yeah, maybe I can just give an impression of where I think FOCIL is in terms of positioning relative to Amsterdam and its inclusion there. Um, yeah, so I feel like there has been quite a lot of conversation around slot restructuring or slot shortening. And the TLDR is that FOSSOL is like basically compatible with both. I think in terms of yeah, practicality, it would be very hard to combine FOSSOL with something like shorter slot times, if my understanding is correct, because shorter slot times is quite a big undertaking, and might require to also like reach out to a lot of different actors throughout the space. So it wouldn't like necessarily like fit too well in terms of yeah, complexity and time needed to implement both. I think there is that's a bit of a different argument for the situation in which FOSSOL is combined with the slot restructuring EIPs, like, it could be PBS, it could be delayed execution, it could be, yeah, probably one of the two. I think there might be a bit more space for FOSSOL to also sort of like fit in the same fork, but let's see how it goes. The official sort of deadline for proposing headliners for Glamsterdam is now over, and now I think like the period of like discussions around what should go into Glamsterdam as a headliner and maybe like not as a headliner is supposed to really kickstart now. So yeah, just small update on this. I do encourage you to like, well, we're not that many in the call, but like if you do have, thoughts or like opinions on whether FOSSOL fits with like slot restructuring or slot shortening EIPs, if you think there is like some urgency around FOSSOL being included in Amsterdam rather than later on, please just like speak up and maybe like talk about it. Yeah. Yeah, as I said earlier, I think there is not much controversy around FOSSOL being important, but there is a lot of different opinions on whether FOSSOL should be included, like in Amsterdam. I think that's like the most contentious part. So yeah, that was just a small update. Does anyone have questions on the more, I guess, like high level fork inclusion topic? Okay, if not, let's get into implementation updates. Mehdi, do you want to share what you just added in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was referring to the we have two spec PRs raised by Jihoon, and there is a discussion on there. I guess we can discuss that. So basically, the consensus spec one is about how should we handle the inclusion list, because initially we put them in the store, and then we decided to do some changes, and it looks like we didn't reach consensus there. So yeah, I know Mikhail has a different view on that, so maybe we can discuss that.
Yeah, for sure. So what are the two main options?
So basically, initially we put the inclusion list in the store and we spec'd that, but now we have a new PR to remove that from the store. And as far if I'm not correct, the last change was to introduce an inclusion list store. and I don't know if everybody agrees on that. So yeah, to be honest, I don't have a strong opinion. In Teku, I've implemented it the way it was initially, which means I put the inclusion list in the store. I know other clients implemented it differently, um, but I think we need to make a decision on that point.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Does anyone have strong opinions then on? So I guess it's like putting it in like a general sort of like generic store, uh, versus creating a new store that is specific for inclusion lists. Is that right?
Yeah, we can summarize it that way. Uh,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. If you have thoughts, Mihail.
Yeah, I'm sorry if there is noise in my background. I was just going to speak about the spec, and yeah, it it probably makes sense to do after implementation updates.
What do you mean? Okay.
I mean, are we doing implementation updates now,
No,
or
we
are
uh,
we
can
finished
uh,
with that?
just dive in. That's part of the implementation discussion.
Okay.
yeah, there aren't really implementation detail. We're basically since few weeks now we're working on the improving the spec, and so yeah, I think we can dive in directly.
Okay. So I don't have a strong opinion about whether it should be inclusion list store, a separate thing to the FOCIL store or not. What I was going to speak about is the state transition and actually specifying how CL and EL are communicated in the state transition function. I think that historically, and it makes a lot of sense to me, we've been trying to abstract away from the particular CL EL communication mechanism. And we have a separate spec for it, which is the engine API specification. So I think it is from that standpoint, it doesn't make sense to actually put the way the CL and DL communicates into a state transition, which is basically what the current PR suggests to do. So I think that, yeah, my point is basically that inclusion list satisfiability doesn't have anything to relate it directly to the state transition itself. So the result of the state transition will not be affected by whether EL is satisfied or not. And I think it's, yeah, it should be separated from the state transition. And we can do it in like when if we don't want to introduce a separate call to the execution engine to the spec, we can just abstract this check away by introducing an abstract function similar to retrieve data blobs as we have today. We can just introduce something like is inclusion list satisfied, and pass a payload and inclusion list to it, something like that. And the fork choice, and the fork choice in the own block handler. So this is kind of like my line of thoughts.
I guess the problem with that though is that it kind of leaves the spec a bit ambiguous, no? Or would this be defined elsewhere, like very clearly?
It leaves the spec abstract. Yes, you're correct. No, it's not going to be defined anywhere else.
Yeah, that's tough.
Why?
I mean, it's not exactly simple, is it? Like it would be beneficial to spec this out so that it's not like an unknown, or like
What
so
do
you
you
don't have
mean?
to
What exactly do you want to spec out?
uh the interaction between the EL and the CL, essentially.
But
Or like the inclusion list satisfy or like I don't know, I guess.
Consensus spec is about the specification of the consensus layer protocol. It's not about the CL-EL communication. We have a separate spec for that because we have a particular CL-EL communication mechanism, which is the engine API that we use today. So I don't think it makes sense to put this communication into the spec and enshrine the particular way of communicating this into the spec.
What exactly are you proposing we remove from the PR? Like,
yeah, ideally we should keep state transition untouched because it's not changed. It's not affected by the inclusion list check. If there is a strong push for enshrining the ELCL communication into state transition, then I think we should remove this function and pass the, or maybe not. I mean, like not remove, but replace it with the.
Yeah. To be clear, which function are you talking about? Are you talking about get inclusion list transactions?
No, I'm talking about state transition itself. It's almost a function now, almost because yeah. Anyway, so it's a function now, and yeah, we should pass EL inclusion lists into it explicitly.
Specifically, which function? Sorry, I guess I'm just confused at this point. Are you talking
So
about
we have
on block?
Yeah.
Or
no, we have a state transition in the PR. It has access to inclusion list store. It reads inclusion lists from that store, right? And then passes them to EL. Then the state transition does not do anything about the result of EL satisfiability check, right?
I do not know.
You mean in the spec or in the actual implementation?
I mean in the spec.
In the spec, it checks if it returns any error.
But then this check is not surfaced to any other part of the spec, right?
What do you mean?
I mean, that the result of this spec is used. Maybe I'm confused. You know.
So if it's return any error, then the CL tries to reorg it. And that happens in on-block functions.
Right, but the spec does not say anything about how this information is passed from the state transition to the on block, right? Or it does?
It does. It wraps the state transition in the try catch, and if it tries to catch if it returns invalid inclusion list error.
Oh, I see.
So I think this is a question about what is the right level of abstraction. So like for other people who are not familiar with this discussion, let me add some. Yeah, thank you, Mehdi. Let me add some, share some context. So, so what I want to ask people here and maybe other devs, especially CL devs, is about like what would be the best way to write the IL validation in the CL spec. The actual client implementation is the CL passes the ILs when calling the new payload engine API. And then the EL validates if the given payload satisfies the IL constraints after transaction execution and before withdrawal processing. So this is not a post state. It's some kind of a state in between, like an intermediary state during the state transition. This is because of some possible edge case. So anyway, and if it fails to satisfy IL constraints, the EL returns an error and then CL votes for its parent. So in the spec, currently it is this part corresponds to process execution payload in state transition function. And currently, this is how the PR is written at the moment. But the feedback is from the CL's perspective, as Mikhail said, the EL state is out of concern. So instead of modifying process execution payload function to pass ILs in the new payload call, if I understood correctly, and then we just use like an abstract call, for example, is inclusionally satisfied on block function. And if the result is false, then CL tries to reorg it. And my question is, what if like this deviates from the actual implementation more than we want? So of course we want good abstraction, but like I think the question is how much do we tolerate the deviation from the actual implementation? And this is also related to whether we want to use fork choice store or inclusionally store, because the reason why I didn't try to put the inclusion list in fork choice store is one, it is not a general purpose storage, and second, in my mind, in the spec we want to use process execution payload function to pass ILs, and this is happening on the beacon chain layer, not fork choice store layer. So if we put ILs in the fork choice store, then the beacon chain should have an access to fork choice store. And this changes like a whole lot of function signatures, and this is too invasive. And looking at other example, like blob also affects on fork choice algorithm, but we don't put it in fork choice store. We use abstract function call to retrieve blob data. So that's why I removed it from fork choice store. But there was another comment that it looks like a little bit of under specification. So that's why I included inclusionally store. And what it does is just basically specifying how that kind of inclusionally store behaves when it receives inclusion list. And it is also used in the process execution payload function when it tries to fetch the inclusion list and pass it to the EL. So to summarize, like, I think we have like three options. One is going with the current implementation. The second is just like what Mikhail suggested. We just remove all the changes in the state transition and use the is inclusively satisfied abstract engine API call in onBlock. And the third option is we just pass ILs in the new payload call as is today. But instead of checking it like if state transition returns an error, we just use the abstract function, which is inclusively satisfied to fetch the result from the EL. So yeah, this is how I view it, but maybe we might not able to reach to consensus because, well, we don't have enough dev, I guess. But yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have an opinion about this? What do you guys, I mean, Justin, maybe, what do
I was just thinking that the latter two options, we wouldn't be able to do as much testing, correct? For inclusion lists. Like if it's an abstract function.
I think we need to monkey patch it, then it would be possible. But yeah, so currently what I've done in my local change is we didn't have inclusion list store, so we just monkey patch the retrieve inclusion list transactions. But I think we can monkey patch inclusion list store as well. So yeah, so it's I think it's just a matter of decision. So
I'm not sure how we would do that for like the reference tests though. Like we would have to ask clients to monkey patch too, right? If I'm understanding that correctly.
Do you remember how we monkey patch test blobs? Because they also use retrieve blob and proof as a monkey patch function.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't think we have tests for that, or I don't remember.
Right.
Or we just did. I don't know. I don't remember. Sorry.
No worries. I also don't remember. Maybe we can just add the testing format to yield inclusion list so that client can consume that testing vectors.
Yeah, maybe.
Yep.
I'll just say that I don't really have a strong opinion on any of this. Whatever is simple and well spec'd, or like clearly spec'd.
Yeah, well, I'm not a dev, but I do think, like in some ways, ILs do introduce a new primitive on the protocol. Like it doesn't really exist now that like some actors constrain others, especially like that the CL sort of like for choice is affected by a very EL heavy sort of feature of having transactions included in a block or not. So it makes sense that it will break some of the super clean abstraction we are trying to keep in some ways. I don't think there is like any fundamental way around that, just because it's very core to the proposal, right? Like this sort of like interaction between the CL and the EL is really, yeah, core to what FOCIL is and what inclusion lists are. So now if I don't know if like there is a clean, simple way to do that, great. If there is one way that allows for more testing than others, I'll maybe tend to lean that way, just because we will need quite a lot of testing for FOCIL, I think. Yeah, but I mean, it does feel like an implementation sort of like choice that is not like extremely, that is going to be like very hard to motivate strongly. So yeah, do you have other like sort of, I mean, you said you didn't have strong opinions, but like did your opinion sort of evolve, or do you still think the same, Mikhail?
On the testing side, I think that we can only expect. So we're speaking about consensus layer testing, ref tests. So there are two possible outcomes of the EL satisfaction check. It's either satisfied or not. I think we cannot go beyond this level of abstraction anyway, and we'll just have to yield this in the spec test. And with the high level of abstraction from the CLEL communication, it's possible.
I don't have any strong opinion on using the abstract function is inclusively satisfied. But I have an opinion that if we were to use new payload call to pass the ILs, then the CL spec is better to specify it in that way. So I'm okay if we don't check if the state transition function call returns an error or not, if it gives us better abstraction. But the engine API call, I mean the new payload call, is better to follow the actual implementation. But I think it would be the CL devs who can make a better decision.
Yeah, but if we do this, introduce this dependency into the spec, then the state transition function should get the inclusion list from somewhere, right?
Yes, and isn't it the same if we were to just use is inclusion list satisfied function only? Do you mean like you want to put inclusion list in the fork choice and then just pass it?
Yeah, I'm just saying that if we want, so my opinion is that if we want for some reason to make inclusion list a part of notify new payload call, then it should rather be explicitly passed to the state transition. And the result of this check should be explicitly returned by the state transition function. Not by an error like it is done today because it's too Pythonic, but by some protocol logic rather than some Python logic. So it's like state transition becomes a new function, which is actually do state transition and check inclusion list satisfiability. It accepts inclusion list explicitly as a parameter, and it also returns not only the modified state as it does today, but it also returns the result of the inclusion list check. Then this check can be used as is now in the PR by the unblock. But I disagree with this. Let's specify it this way. But if there is a strong push for, pass and EL to notify new payload in the consensus layer spec, then we can do it this way.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, one of the pushback is also on how the inclusion. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the general idea of not trying to sort of make it implicit that it is like modifying the fork choice in some way, like because it effectively is. And I don't really have a problem with like having, the IL satisfiability as an explicit input into the fork choice function. And also that like the sort of like vote or not vote is conditioned by whether the IL condition is satisfied. Yeah, I wouldn't mind having that instead of just that error popping off. I'm wondering whether like other people have opinions on this, but like at least intuitively, I see why it's maybe a bit nicer to have it explicitly defined.
I mean, if we explicitly try to change state transition function, then we have to change all the function signatures from state transition down to process execution payload. And I think that's invasive changes. And looking at how clients are implemented, they use their own way to cache inclusion list and fetch it somehow. They don't change state transition functions.
Okay, so you think basically it's better to contain the validity of the payload on the EL side, and so all the CL has to know is whether the payload is sort of like returns an error or not.
Rather than changing all the state transition related functions, because that is how it is implemented. And for me, I may be biased because I know how both CL and EL are implemented. So for me, that's much easier to read and comprehend. But I also understand that there is another separate spec for the specific CL and EL communication. So we want to use that abstraction. So yeah, but like I'm of the opinion that making it explicit is a bit too invasive.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Right. Then yeah, I mean, if it introduces a lot of complexity on the CL side of things, because you actually do need to change a lot of things for if you want to explicitly change the fork choice, then yeah, maybe I go back on what I was saying before. I feel like yeah, maybe we need to balance like simplicity of implementing the actual thing we want to implement and the conceptual abstraction of what it actually does. Because I agree that yeah, conceptually like it does actually change the fork choice. Like we can't really go around that. But if it makes it much easier to constrain changes to the EL in terms of like payload and whether it's valid basically or not, rather than having to change like the whole state transaction function and whether like to vote or not for a block. I feel like I would be leaning that way, but yeah, it's hard for me to comment too much on it also because I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I don't usually. I'm not a core dev, so
Maybe I can, try to summarize all the discussions we had here, and then I can leave that as a comment in the PR so that everyone can take a look into it. And I don't think we have to make a decision today, so we can invite more core devs to take a look into it and then provide some feedback. Yeah, so like I'm also okay with like avoiding if the state transition returns on error or not, because I feel like that's somehow mixing the CL and EL communication too much. But like, yeah, I think we are just circling back to the same question, like what is the right level of abstraction we want? But I guess we are lacking of CL devs here. But yes, Mikhail.
Yeah, I just wanted to add maybe this kind of like summarize my thoughts on it for today. I agree that we should not make any decision, may not make any decision today. We have time. I just wanted to emphasize that if we think that this check should be explicit, the inclusion list is explicitly passed as a parameter, the result is explicitly returned by the state transition function, and we are thinking that this is going to be an invasive change, then we should think that is the implicit way of doing it also invasive? Why can't we just change the semantics of the state transition? It's not only the interface. The interface is easy to change, but it's also the semantics of the function. So we add one more semantics to the state transition in the spec, which is from the spec standpoint is not good and should be justified very well, to my opinion. So that's just it.
yeah. Can you like just so I'm sure I understand what you're saying is like yeah, if we imagine we contain like the issue of having to change the whole fork choice function by just like conceptually on like returning an error of like saying the payload is valid or is invalid, and so it's like basically you either explicitly add like a parameter and like another sort of input to the fork choice function, or you add an invalidity condition to the payload on the EL side. and you're saying both are like invasive. Is that what you're saying? Is like basically I mean, you still have differences in terms of how hard it's going to be to implement on both on the CL and EL side, no?
No, I'm just I'm saying that if we can't for some reason make this check explicit in the state transition, not in the fork choice, in the state transition.
Yeah.
And the reason is that it is invasive. So we should. I don't see the difference between implicitly doing it and explicitly doing the same thing. So, but explicitly doing it just highlights us that this change is invasive. I'm just trying to explain why I think it's a wrong way to modify state transition in this case. We know that this change is like, because it's too invasive. For me, it's too invasive. It's very invasive for the state transition to have some specifics about how CL and DL communicate.
Yeah, I get what you mean, but I have one question for you. So whether we change function signatures or not, if we decide to use new payload engine API call to pass the ILs, do you still think that we should not specify in the spec?
Oh, I think with that we should make it explicit, like path the IL to state transition and return the not the error, not by doing it by handling the error, by catching the error, because it becomes a spec, right? So it becomes a spec logic. So it should be written in a not in the Python way, but it should rather be written in the spec logic way. So like a more, I don't know, I probably don't know right words to how to express this.
Okay. Yeah, well, I feel like there are two things, but correct me if I'm wrong. One is you are saying that it is a complex change that is, and whether it's explicit and implicit, like it actually does change the fork choice. I mean, I think that's true, but like I think most of people that have been working on FOCIL are like probably assuming that it's worth adding this complexity and change to the protocol because it gives a lot. So I think there is a trade-off there that, I mean, yeah, most protocol upgrades will bring some added complexity. And then if the trade-off is like in the favor of, but that added complexity will actually give us something we really care about, then it's probably worth doing. And then the second very different thing you're saying is like you don't like the Pythonic way of expressing of like just like having like an error expressed to I don't know, to like surface the fact that the payload didn't satisfy the inclusion list, and that's yeah. I mean that's two very different questions to me. I think the second one is worth maybe trying to express it in a different way. For the first one, if it's just a more general comment about like it actually brings some complexity into the protocol, and you're not sure it outweighs the benefits of having FOCIL in the first place. Yeah, we can definitely have that discussion, but it's a very different one.
Yeah, and the third concern is that we are going to introduce something to the state transition function that does not have anything to deal with the state transition itself. I mean, it does not affect the result of the state transition function. And that's the problem. So we are just adding an additional semantics to this function. There are actually two functions in one. This is how this spec works today. This was my other concern. Yeah, but I think, yeah, let's just stop here and probably if anyone, if if this discussion will be relevant, we can continue next time, or at some time after.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay. And if we can also ask like the opinion of some other people, I guess. Yeah, Jihoon, you said you were okay to do that. If we can summarize things and maybe post it in the PR, but also like post it on the IL or like inclusion list Discord chat, so people can have a look and sort of like comment on this. I think might be useful to just have a bit more visibility on this. Yeah, does that sound good?
Yeah, I'm just happy that we just like use this time to bring our thoughts on the table and see like what kind of options are ahead of us. And yeah, I can of course like share the. Oh no, I really appreciate your feedback, and yeah, please just yeah. And yeah, thank you for your providing feedback, and let me share the summarize in the Discord maybe, so that if my summarize is wrong or off, then please just leave a comment there, so we can have a better a summary before asking other core devs for feedback. So yeah.
Yeah, sounds great. Cool. Okay, so are there other like items that people wanted to talk about other than this?
Actually, I have it's a short one. So in the beginning, Mehdi shared two PRs. One is a CL spec, and the other is a execution API spec. So in the execution API spec, I'd like to change to use fork choice updated instead of update payload inclusion list. It's because inclusion lists are part of payload building process, and it seems there is no strong objection to overloading payload attributes. So I've been asking people about like what would be better engine API last week, and then this is the conclusion that I got. So using fork choice updated seems semantically better. The CL can call fork choice updated, for example, at the beginning of the slot without inclusion list, and then it can call it again with inclusion list after the proposer's inclusion list cutoff. And right, I'm sorry, keep just using our time, but lastly, this is also Mika's feedback. I think we should introduce IL broadcast deadline at 12 seconds into the slot to avoid split view by IL equivocation. So let's consider this scenario. A proposer proposes a block at 12 seconds into the slot, and the block doesn't satisfy some IL. Then 50% of our testers vote for its parent, but some IL committee equivocates that IL, and let's say the rest of our testers recognize this equivocation and exclude that IL during IL validation, so they vote for that block. So although this might be a rare edge case, introducing IL broadcast deadline at 12 seconds into the slot will avoid this tester split view before and after their attestation, because we do not reevaluate IL validation, even if we have IL equivocation after a tester finish their attestation.
Right. Okay, and you're saying we don't have an explicit deadline at 12 seconds now, right?
We don't have it, do we?
No, I don't think we do. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just adding, yeah, that actually sounds good. But maybe good to also write it down so more people can give input. It does make sense to me. Like, yeah, we should have a sort of like end timer. But yeah, if you have a chance to just write down, like it doesn't have to be like sort of like fleshed out, but just like give you like write down the idea, and so we can just add it to the spec. Then I think that would be quite useful.
Right. Then let me share that summaries of two things by tomorrow.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Great. Okay. No, thanks for sharing. That's useful. Okay, maybe a more general high-level comment to finish is like, I think it's nice to like really sort of hash down implementation details and sort of like discuss exactly how the spec should look like, but I feel like it's gonna be done anyways when or if, let's say, FOCIL gets CFI'd. One thing that I sort of grasped in some chats, so it's a bit informal, I think, but is that there might be some like additional constraints on EIPs if they don't come with like spec tests. So I think it would be important to also sort of like have some. Doesn't have to be exhaustive. It doesn't have to, cover all the crazy weird edge cases. But I think it would be nice to also sort of push on this soonish because, yeah, we are like basically in the middle of like of discussions around whether to include EAPs or not. So if that is a factor, I think it would be nice to have like spec tests and sort of like be ahead of the curve. Although I don't know how.
We are,
yeah.
just to be clear, we are publishing spec tests, reference tests for FOCIL EIP 7805, correct?
Wait, what are they?
There are. I mean, it's mostly like the standard suite of tests, to be clear. I don't
Okay.
believe there are any specific like inclusion list tests yet.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, nice. Okay, good to know. Yeah, I had in mind like the sort of like, yeah, trying to test some even basics, basic tests around like inclusion list per se of or what can happen, or I don't know, equivocation and stuff like this, or do we have time to propagate different objects in time? Are the deadlines set correctly? All of these questions are like, I think there are like we got ourselves like some really big margins, so I think we are all safe. But like, yeah, just saying it would be nice to sort of have some tests around that specifically. But
I agree, and that'll be quite a lot. That's fine.
yeah. Okay, cool. And yeah, that being said, I think like some other UIPs like are not even close to being even like spec or defined or specified. So we shouldn't like take this too crazily. I don't know. I don't think it will be like a super hard requirement, but just like sort of like nice to keep in mind. Yeah, Jihoon?
Right. So I just wanted to ask you about how much test coverage we want, because our spec is changing, so and that affects on how the spec test should be written. But I can write tests that are not affected by the changing spec, and would it be okay?
Yeah, I think we should start by having these tests in any case. Like maybe that's a good way to think about it. I think like two maybe dimensions are important. The one is like we want to test like very obvious failure cases. Like we don't want to necessarily get into like the super weird edge cases now. And like we want to test things that are less likely to change given like the spec considerations. Yeah, if we can have some tests that fit well with those two dimensions, I think that would be good enough. So yeah.
Okay, so I think the test we can have today would be something not related to the changing part, which is related to inclusion list committee and the kind of stuff. And since we are currently discussing where to put inclusion list and so on, so that part cannot be tested, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
just
Well,
yeah.
We can start with that. I think it's fine. I just don't want, I just don't want to like block things because the spec might change. Like I feel like in any case the spec will probably change. Like once a lot of people look at it and like try to implement it in and like try to actually work on it very seriously for like future forks. But yeah, let's definitely start with like tests that wouldn't be affected by this, and we can just like check back in a couple of weeks or something.
Yeah, sounds great. So I will just upload the spec test that I already made, and I will just move on to the EL spec test while we are discussing the CL spec.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks. Cool. Anything else from anyone else? Okay. Well, thanks a lot for coming and see you all online. Bye bye.